Hello, this is Arne Koets from the Kemenate in Lauwreuden, and today I was trying yet another mic, but also I'm trying to talk about scabbards. And I'm going to attempt to try and do something that I haven't done for years, but I've done a few years ago and was, to me, very interesting, on how to wear a scabbard in conjunction with armor. And then we'll have a little bit of a look at how to wear scabbards and in which angle on horseback. Now, for the purposes of this video, I usually talk about vertical carry and diagonal carry. The idea being that in vertical carry, the sword is more or less vertical up to a certain degree. So I would still call that vertical carry. And diagonal carry, the sword is further over like this. And this means that the sword becomes more pommel out and point out. Now then, of course, all of this can be carried around the person to various degrees. And this, of course, makes it a little bit faffy to compare them. One of the things you see with diagonal carry is that it can end up in between the legs of somebody wearing it, in particular when you've drawn the sword already. The other thing is that a diagonal carry means that the pommel is now further out and can be interfering with what I might be doing with a poleaxe, for instance. Whereas a vertical carry like this, it is out of the way. Now this has a bit to do with the length of the sword, of course, because this blade and whatever extra length the scabbard has is about the same as my leg. So this scabbard is sort of set up to roughly sit in between the dimple between the tip of my femur and the tip of my ilium. So it kind of sits there and wants to stay there. This is also a relatively long handle for medieval standards for swords you might carry. So this is a long sword. This is a fairly typical length of long sword. In fact, it's kind of long for medieval standards. However, there are some pretty darn long swords around. Most of the longer ones are a bit more likely to be 16th century though. They do grow over time. This is a 90 centimeter blade. I think the hilt is about 25 centimeters. Now what you might have noticed is I'm wearing some armor, but I'm only wearing part of it. I'm wearing the limb armor, and on my torso I'm wearing mail. So I have my mail bralettes or underpants, and I have my mail shirt on. This is actually suspending the arm harness at the moment, and underneath this I have an arming doublet, which is suspending the leg armor, in this case. Now this might be very much a way that somebody might walk around in a camp. So get up in the morning and get at least some of the armor on, because you never know what might happen in warfare in the rest of the day. For instance, similar reasons why horses are cleaned very early in the morning in most of history where horses are used for warfare. So that the horses are groomed and you can slap a saddle on it and there's not going to be a big cake of mud under it, which might mean that your horse will be out of commission for the rest of the campaign. Hence, some of these things were just done as a routine precaution. And one of these things you can do is wear, for instance, this amount of armor. There's some variation, of course. You might just wear the mail and not the arm harness, for instance. But there's quite a lot of examples of people just wearing the greaves, or just wearing the mail and the greaves, and things like that. And we have written accounts that people didn't manage to actually put their cuirass on before they rode into battle. At least you have some protection in the form of the mail coat. You can even sleep like this. So wearing a helmet when sleeping I find a bit annoying. I have slept in the full plate, which is doable but a bit annoying. But sleeping in just the leg armor and the mail is actually relatively comfortable. So this might mean that you only have to put on a few bits in the morning before stuff kicks off. Now, if you're just walking around, you might want to have your sidearm with you. You might be attending to your troops or to your lance, for instance, within a Burgundian army, and you might want to have a sword with you. Even though you're not on horseback yet, you don't have a lance or a poleaxe or a halberd as your main weapon, you at least have a weapon. And this could be slung just simply like this. I just used a simple knot and just a buckle, and it just sits there, and I can shift it around a little bit, can be a bit more out of my way. If I need to kneel down, which frankly, you don't have to do very often in a day. For instance, to pick up a horse's hooves, I can just pick up a horse's hooves. I mean, the arm harness is a bigger impediment to that than anything else. But if I need to lean or pick something up from the ground, just in regular use, I can simply grab this, move it, and then reach for the ground. That is not a particularly big problem. So the instances where I might deliberately kneel down are the ones where I'm at leisure to use my hands to reorder the swords. This is why this is probably not a particularly big priority. So I could also wear coats over top of this, or of course take the sword off, put the coat on, put the sword back on. Both are kind of doable, but you at least have the weapon with you. Obviously, drawing the sword with a coat over top of it will be really awkward, but it can be done. Now, this is one of the things that I'm proposing here, is that you can then, from this position, slap your cuirass on and actually not take the sword off first. Suppose you're in a hurry. And this might be an explanation why we see the sword suspended at the edge of the fold, but we see no belt in some cases. And with a little bit of editing magic, I've got the cuirass on. So now what we see here is that I've put the cuirass on over top of this strap, and the sword is now sitting quite neatly in this little hole here. I might need to take a side tasset off for that, which is why they're quite often able to be taken off with buckles. Now this means that the sword is a little bit more stable than if it was just strapped around the cuirass, because then they can walk, if you wear them for a long ride or a long march, they can start sitting behind your bum and things like that. Now just to show, I can still draw the sword quite readily with this position of the scabbard. It could be slightly easier if it had been sitting a bit more in front of me. So for instance, some of the 13th century scabbard positions, the sword is sitting not only slightly more diagonally, but also a little bit more around the person. And this makes drawing slightly easier, in particular if there's also a shield involved, which reduces the opportunity. This, however, means that the sword is very much out of the way. So, when I'm wearing the sword with a poleaxe, what you might be able to see is that I can use the weapon quite freely without the sword getting in the way. In particular, when I'm standing next to other people, this doesn't swing out particularly far as I'm using the weapon in various ways. Now, this also means that this is distinct advantage over having a diagonal carry with the pommel potentially getting in the way of the shaft of the pommel, of the poleaxe. So this is kind of one of these other things of why this particular carry is an improvement. Notice that I have a lot of space until my armpit with this particular hilt. I could have another 10 centimeters, but as it goes up my chest, it will start pushing out due to the shape of the cuirass. And this, of course, will have a limitation in just how long the hilt can be. Shorter hilt swords, obviously, are even easier. So, about scabbards. I've jury-rigged this diagonal carry on Katja's sword here. And you notice that there's a sword pommel here, and then the whole sword is pointing this way. So because of this extra knot here, the sword is now diagonally pointed. This makes some drawing actions a little bit easier. For instance, behind a shield, she might be able to draw the sword slightly easier. Moreover, it is lying on her leg and thereby is suspended a little bit away from the horse. Now this might be easier for her when she is riding her horse because it's not slapping into the horse. However, you can see that there's quite a pointy band sticking out the end here, as you can see there. Now, as I try to ride a little bit closer, let's see if my horse will do it. So when we get to stirrup, yep, there we go. You start seeing that this is now poking my horse. There. Now, obviously, when she's moving, her hip is moving, her sword will be moving, this will be poking my horse. He's already annoyed by it as we speak. And we're only stirrup to stirrup, let alone when we go knee in knee. Now if I just force this and go, sorry horse, you'll have to deal with this, and I'll go knee in knee, what will happen is I'll be pushing the sword this way and pushing the pommel into her elbow. And the horse immediately now, of course, goes away from the influence of the sword, but as I push this over, this will be pushing against her elbow. Now, especially when we're cantering or trotting, this will be quite uncomfortable. Now, at the same time, you might find that I was also wearing a sword all along. Now, I've got it in vertical carry. Now, notice that this particular sword has a longer hilt. Now this sword is now hanging down. There is of course this particular pad here on this particular saddle. On a medieval saddle it will lie slightly closer to this horse, or I could lie it behind it there. Now if I go to the other side, this might be a subtle difference, but it is an important difference. Up. And I'll go to the other side, and I'll stand to her side here. Now I'm actually touching her stirrup, and my sword is still not actually touching her horse. So I'm actually technically closer. Oh, up there. And now you notice that I can ride into her with this particular scabbard quite nicely. Now also, when she now presses into me with her horse, you'll see that the scabbard won't move as much. So there we go. You notice that her leg comes first, and then she's still not touching my scabbard. So if I go into her, you see that the scabbard will move a little, but not as much. And this means that when I'm holding my reins, my rein hand will not be interfered with by the hilt, even though this is a longer hilt. Now I can play a little bit around with where I put this sword behind my leg or on my leg. I could lay it on my hip joint. This is a little bit easier to control, but also I can clamp the sword with my elbow and make it go away from my next door neighbor. If this had been a diagonal carry, it would go out and rotate around, and I'm already pushing her horse around with my scabbard. And this is why vertical carry seems to be the go-to thing for horsemen. Now you might notice that there's multiple points of attachment that you might see on sabers, but these lower straps are often extremely long, and what they actually do is use the saber curve to fall around the horse's rump. So it actually turns around and lies right flat onto the horse if it's a curved saber with a curved scabbard. Now the other thing is that even if this is walking around my torso a little bit and the sword is lying fairly far back, then of course starting to draw might be slightly more difficult. So what I can do is I can use the hilt to draw the sword quite nicely. And then I can also bring it back and then avoid my sweater and bring it in quite nicely. So this doesn't really detract from what we need out of the carry. It's easy to do. It's easy to do when there's no particular attachment points on the actual scabbards, and it's easier to not get in the way of your next door neighbor.